So I am I'm English chair, and this is the program that I put together with the help of a lot of callers and other people, volunteers, to have something English related and flavored. I want to hear back from people. If you have thoughts, uh, commentary, suggestions, things you liked, you just want to say hi, please reach out to me at englishprogram@cdny.org. I'd love to get your feedback. If desired, you can make a donation to CDNY at cdny.org/give. I am Dorothy Cummings, and I am your CDNY English Country Dance Chair in the time of COVID. I'd also like to thank our other volunteers tonight. Jeff Berry is running Facebook. He's hosting on Facebook. He's doing the live stream and checking for any chats there, any Q&A. And Danny Wolkowitz is running our door on Zoom. Thanks, Danny. He'll also be collecting your chats. So tonight's guest speaker, who's actually, our homegrown caller, is Tom Amesse. Tom Amesse has been a dance leader for, I think, 20 years now. He joined English country dance as part of the New York Times inspired wave of dancers, as was I, but Tom began calling much sooner, and he is very well known in the Northeast region and in New York City particularly, but he's also called in a sprinkling of places across North America, US and Canada, and a couple of sites in the British Isles as well. He has long been interested in history and has gotten, more dance history interested as he's learned more dance titles and so on. So tonight's topic has to do with politics and history and events from another time. So we can just take out all our anxieties and throw them over there and listen to what it is from another time. So events that had a relationship to dances that we know and love. So with that, I want to welcome Tom and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. And I'd like to thank Dorothy very much for all of the efforts that she put in to get this series together. It's very hard work. I want to thank CDNY for sponsoring it. And I want to thank Susan Amesse for all of the help she gave me in preparing this. Thank you. Although I'm not an historian, I really do love history. I've been reading history my entire life. So tonight's news hour is not a dance lesson, but it's a history lesson. It's a look at a piece of that history behind the dance. I was dancing since the mid-1990s in Duane Hall, which is now the Church of the Village that you know. And one of the first evenings that I walked in there, Beverly Francis was calling, and she called a dance called Jack's Maggot. Well, she was very good about telling all the newbies what a maggot was, but I was more interested in who Jack was. A few years later, I was lucky enough to start calling dances studying with Beverly and as well as Jean Morrow and Paul Ross. And I found that the dance titles and the names behind them, they weren't just names, but there was this rich history. There were dance masters, Mr. Isaac, Mr. Lane, Mr. Beveridge. They were all real people, but where did Jack's Maggot, Jack's Health, Jack's Farewell, and even Lily Burlero, where did they come from? So let's try to find Jack. But finding the right Jack was quite a long search for me. There are something on the order of 20 dances with the with the name Jack in the title. Most of them likely refer to Jacobites. Now, Jacobites were followers of Jacobus, which is Latin for James. And in this case, it was James II. He was in England, ruled England from 1685 to 1689. And the Jacobites supported him and his heirs' return to the throne. But why would he have to be reinstated? Well, that question took me back to the year 1154. And in 1154, the House of Plantagenet was founded by the Anjou family of France. It was the next house after the Normans. And that went on around 300 years, but the last 80 years or so, from the end of the 1300s through 1485, it split into two branches. It was the Lancasters and the Yorks. And they kind of went back and forth taking the throne of England from each other, and it culminated in 1455 in what we know as the War of the Roses. They fought each other. A lot of people died, but then just before 1485, Richard III, you've probably all heard of him, he usurped the throne. His brother was the king. There were two sons that his brother had, and they were next in line with the throne. But he he wanted to be the king. So he got himself named the protector of his nephews, and they abruptly disappeared. The screen you see now on the left is Henry VII. On the right, that's Richard III on a horse. In 1485, Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII, raises a force of some Welsh soldiers, and there were some French soldiers involved. He marched into England and he challenged Richard III for the throne. And you've heard of the Battle of Bosworth Field from Shakespeare as well. Well, in Shakespeare, toward the end, Richard is yelling, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. He was knocked off of his horse. Well, the reality is he actually died on his horse. His horse was stuck in the mud. He was trying to get away. The Lancasterians surrounded him, and he was killed with a halberd. I guess Shakespeare couldn't get a horse on stage for him. But Henry claims the throne through the right of conquest. He goes on to marry Richard III's sister, who was Elizabeth of York, and he effectively ends the War of the Roses. The red rose was the symbol of the Lancasters, the white rose, the symbol of the Yorks. He makes a new symbol for the Tudor family, which he starts, and it's a red-end white rose. Henry VII and Elizabeth go on to have 4 children: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. There were other children they had, but they all died very young, shortly after they were born. So Henry VII has a little bit of a problem. He's looked upon by some as illegitimate because his great-grandfather was not married to his great-grandmother when his grandfather was born. So he wanted to try to legitimize his throne. And at the same time, England was poor. They needed money. So he looked around and he finds a princess in Aragon, which is in Spain. And it's Princess Catherine of Aragon. She's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella. So he arranges Catherine to marry his son Arthur, the eldest. And along with Catherine comes a 200,000 ducat dowry. Well, Arthur dies a few months later, just after the marriage. And now Henry VII is in a quandary. He really wants to keep Catherine in England because if she goes back to Spain, she takes the 200,000 ducats with her. So briefly, because his wife had already died, Elizabeth had died, he thinks about marrying her, but decides that his son Henry, who is the new heir apparent to the throne, should marry her. But there's a little bit of a problem because in the book of Leviticus, it says you cannot marry your brother's widow. So they were considering getting papal dispensation for this. But Catherine, whether she's coerced or not, we're not sure. She swears that her marriage to Arthur is never consummated. So now Henry's free to marry her. Well, in 1509, he marries her, and at the same time, his father dies, he becomes the King of England. She's 7 years older than him, but by all accounts, they had a fairly happy marriage at the beginning. They did have a son, but he unfortunately died 2 months old. And they went on for 24 years married. They had one more child. She goes on to become Mary, Queen of England. But in 1533, Catherine is now beyond her childbearing years. He really does want a son to succeed him. So he meets Anne Boleyn, who is a sister of one of the courtiers of his queen. But there's a problem here. He needs an annulment. but he thinks he has leverage with Rome because of this next event. Let's see the next slide, please. So we go back to 1517. So coffee first arrived in Europe in 1515. Martin Luther in 1517 has one too many cups. He writes his 95 Theses against the Catholic Church. Most of them had to do with indulgences. People at that time had to pay to get into heaven. If you were rich enough, you had an open door. If you didn't have the money, tough luck. So there's a very a dramatic story about him taking the 95 Theses down to the church house and nailing it to the door. And the reality is the church house door at the time was something of a bulletin board. It would say like babysitting services available. I have a chariot to sell. This is why I hate the Catholic Church. So the 95 Theses, actually, he sends copies all over Europe. People are very upset about this. Well, it reaches London in 1519, and Henry writes a scathing rebuttal, and it's called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. And as a result of that, a lot of people forego going away from the Catholic Church and side with the Catholic Church against Martin Luther, although a lot of people also did convert to Lutheranism. Leo X, the Pope at the time, awards Henry a title, Defender of the Faith. So now fast forward those 14 or so years to 1533, Henry sends a note to Rome that he wants his marriage to Catherine annulled because, hey, I'm Henry, I'm the defender of the faith. And besides, this is Anne Boleyn, and look, she's hot. Okay. The Pope at this time, Clement I don't have the number, I think it's the 7th. He can find a way to annul Henry's marriage, but he doesn't. And the reasons are somewhat religious, but also political. The area around Rome at the time was actually owned, all of that, by Spain. And the Pope didn't want to anger Spain because Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. So he denies the annulment. Henry hits the ceiling. He decides, I'm starting my own church. He cuts Rome off from the Church of England. Now, basically, on the basic level, the Church of England is the Catholic Church under a different name with a different head. So instead of the Pope, it's Henry VIII, and instead of Catholic, it's the Church of England. But all the ceremonies, everything else is very basically the same. He marries Anne Boleyn. And next slide, please. There she is. There's Anne Boleyn on the left. On the right is Jane Seymour. These are his next two wives in rapid succession. He's married to Anne a little over 2 years, has one daughter. She goes on to become Elizabeth I. Has a son with Jane Seymour. This is his first son. He goes on to become Edward VI. Jane actually dies of complications after childbirth. Henry's very distraught about this. He marries 3 more women, no more children, and then he dies in 1547. Now his son, his daughter Mary, who's the marriage to her mother was annulled. So she was technically not in succession for the throne at this time. And she was basically kept under house arrest, as was her mother in 2 different houses. And Mary was kept in a house called Hunsdon House. And this next slide is a drawing of Hunsdon House. There it is. It's in the Keller and Schama book. If you have that, this is the drawing. It was done in the 1800s, but it's basically the same. Mary was kept there. And her half-brother, Edward, visited her fairly often. They grew quite fond of each other. He once wrote that he disapproved of her taste in foreign dances. But at one of his visits, there was a portrait of him done, which is the next slide. And this will be Edward VI. This was done at Hunsdon House. He was named king in Henry's will, and he continued to promote his father's agenda, but he had a couple of close advisors because he was 10 years old when he became king. They were Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and John Dudley, who was the Duke of Northumberland. They likely advised him what to do, and he followed their advice. Now, because of the closeness that he had with his sister Mary, he wrote a will. Now, why would he write a will when he was young? Well, it's been written a lot that he was sickly, but there's a lot of evidence that he was not a sickly boy. But when he was about 15 or 16, he developed what was called a sweating sickness. And it's still a mysterious disease, but it could possibly have something to do with a hantavirus. Well, he wrote his will naming someone else as the queen, as the next queen to succeed him, because he knew Mary was Catholic. Mary corresponded with her mother, even though she wasn't allowed to. There were some sympathizers that went back and forth, and she followed the religion that her mother did. So Edward writes Lady Jane Grey, who is his cousin through Henry VIII's younger sister Mary, as the next Queen of England upon his death. So he dies. The news of his death is kept quiet by Northumberland. Northumberland takes Lady Jane to the Tower of London, which is a safe haven for her at that moment. And on the left here, you see Lady Jane. She's coronated about 4 days after Edward dies. Then the news comes out of Edward's death and Jane's coronation. Northumberland goes out to take Mary to London to keep her out of the way, but she retreats to East Anglia, raises a lot of her followers, and marches on London. Now, Northumberland knows he made a mistake here, so he tries to backtrack, but it doesn't work. Lady Jane is captured. She's put into the Tower as a prisoner this time. Northumberland is executed, and Mary at first decides she's going to spare her. She's going to spare Lady Jane, but later she felt that she would be too much of a threat, and she executed her. So Mary, on the right there, very stern-looking woman there, she starts to immediately turn the Church of England back to the Roman Catholic Church. She recognizes the Pope. She has many what she calls heretics executed, and she gets the name of Bloody Mary as a result of that. A year after she's coronated in 1553, this is 1554, she marries the King of Spain, Philip II. He becomes the King of England and Ireland, the King of Portugal. He's already the King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Sicily. He's the Duke of Milan. He has quite a resume. But there's this prenup that the Parliament insists on, that if Mary dies before him, he's no longer King of England. It has to go on to the next in succession. Philip convinces Mary to join the Spanish in their war against the French over those areas around Italy. And as a result of that, it's a disastrous war. The last possession that England owned on the mainland was Calais. They lost that to the French as a result of that war. And she dies a year later in 1558. Philip goes back to England, to Spain. And Elizabeth takes over and starts to reinstate the reforms that her father and her brother did. This is Elizabeth. She reestablished the independence of the Church of England from Rome. She she had the Elizabethan religious settlement passed. It required anyone who was appointed to a public or church office to swear allegiance to the monarch as the head of the church and the state. But despite severe penalties, a lot of people still continued to secretly practice Catholicism. And I found a very interesting aside, which I can't go into because of time limitations, about how Mary's Queen of Scots had something to do with the lost colony of Roanoke in North Carolina. It's a fascinating story that I found. But Elizabeth loved to dance. She danced a very difficult and demanding dance called the Galliard. There was a John Stanhope of the Privy Chamber who wrote, "The Queen is so well as I assure you, 6 or 7 galliards in a morning, besides music and dancing, is her ordinary exercise." So we're going to watch what a galliard was, and you'll notice the very vigorous, quick stepping, the very intricate stepping of this. So we'll watch this first video. So as you can see, if you did 6 or 7 of them every morning, you'd be in very good shape as well. She also danced another dance. It was called La Volta. Now, La Volta means turning in Italian, and the main figure consisted of a leaping, turning, lifting motion, and it was considered indecent and scandalous. It required highly intimate contact between the partners of the opposite sex. Now, there was a guide to La Volta that stated, if you wish to dance La Volta, you must place your right hand on the damsel's back, the left below her busk, and by pushing her with your right thigh beneath her buttocks, turn her. Now, the busk, when a lady wore a corset in the morning, in order to keep her posture straight, there was a pocket down the middle of it where you would slip a whalebone stay, and it kept her erect. That ended somewhere around the belly button. So the left hand was supposed to reach below the busk. You're reaching for her nether region. So it was actually quite a scandalous dance. Now, in this next video, it's a mirror image, and I'm not sure why, whether it was something to do with the uploading, but the gent's left hand is on her back. His left leg, watch it closely, he's lifting her with it. And his right hand is much more polite on her waist. So let's take a look at it. So that was La Volta. There were 2 Hollywood motion pictures with a version of the dance. One is Elizabeth with Kate Blanchett and Joseph Fiennes as Lord Dudley. The other one is Gwyneth Paltrow and again Joseph Fiennes as William Shakespeare. They show versions of it. They're not terribly historically correct, but I think they're posted in the chat section if you want to copy the links. Now, the late 16th century, and excuse my French, I'm not a French speaker, the pronunciation may be a bit off, but there was a gentleman by the name of Jehan Tabireau who anagramized his name to Thoineau Arbeau. Now, he wrote a manual called Orchestrographie in 1589, which was a study of late 16th century French Renaissance social dance. And the thing here, he was very innovative in his dance tabulations. He's the first known one, I believe, to put the steps under the pieces of music where they were supposed to be done. If you look at the Playford Dance Manual in 1651, the English Dance Master, it's in that style, and I think he has Arbeau to thank for that. Now, he also put detailed directions about what the footwork would be like. And he was not only a publisher, but he was a musician, and he wrote music. Excuse me. And you may know this tune by him. That, as you know, is Horseplay by Gary Rudman. The tune was written in the end of the 16th century by Arbeau. Arbeau is an interesting guy. He was a lawyer. He became a cleric, which is probably why he anagramized his name for the dance books. And he was very rare in that he actively pursued dance, and he recommended it in a strikingly modern way as good exercise. 1603, Elizabeth dies. Henry VIII has no more heirs, direct heirs. So it's decided that James I would be asked to take the throne of England. James I, at this time, was James VI of Scotland. He's a descendant of Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret. She married into the Stuart family. And although Catholicism was outlawed in Scotland in 1550, just like in England, it was practiced by many people secretly, and some of those people were the Stuarts. He came to England realizing he was in a tenuous situation. So he felt he needed the support of as many people as he could. So he basically made a statement when he became king that he would support religious tolerance, and would not prosecute anyone practicing anything other than the Church of England, provided that they did not flaunt it and they pretended to give obedience to the law. So he was quite popular for some of his reign. He dies in 1625, and his son Charles becomes the king, and here's where things change. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, and he actually married an openly Catholic Bourbon princess, Henrietta Maria of France. And now it's 100 years since Henry VIII established the Church of England, so it's the law of the land. And England was seen as a Protestant country. The 30 Years' War was going on the mainland, and England was expected to give assistance to the Protestant countries during that war, but they didn't. They kept out of the war. He made a lot of decisions on his own. He tried to move the Church of England back toward Anglicanism, which is what the Catholic Church was just before, which was the Catholic Church under a different name, in a step to reinstate Catholicism. Well, in 1628, 3 years after he's coronated, the House of Commons is very alarmed by this. They submit the Petition of Right to him, and that tells him they want their power back. Well, he accepts the Petition of Right very graciously, and the next day he dissolves Parliament, takes their power away. He was allowed to do that. This happened for various reasons several times during his reign, from 1628 to 1642. And the only time he reinstated Parliament was when he needed help with, one of the only times was when he needed help with taxation. So in 1642, he tried to arrest 5 members of the parliament, and he enters the House of Commons, which no monarch does. And it's, anyway, a religious war broke out as a result of it. Now, at this time, there were a lot of Puritans in England, and they were not only a religious power, but a political power, and a lot of them were in Parliament. So the followers of Charles, you notice how long and flowing curly his hair is. It's probably a wig, but they were called Cavaliers because of the style of hair, and they wore that badge proudly. But the members of Parliament who were associated with the Puritans were called Roundheads. And the reason is, this is an example of what a Roundhead would have been. It was a derogatory term given to people who kept their hair close cropped to their heads. And so it was the Roundheads against the Cavaliers. The English Civil War was going on 1642 to 1649. It was actually a series of 3 different wars, also called the War of the Three Kingdoms. It had to do with Scotland and Ireland as well. 1649, during the war, Oliver Cromwell rises to power. He's a Puritan in Parliament. Now, notice he doesn't keep his hair short, but he's the leader of the Roundheads. He's the leader of the Puritan powers, the parliamentarians. They actually win the war. They capture Charles. They imprison him, and Cromwell orders his execution. Now, this is 1649. Cromwell appoints himself the Lord Protector. And it's interesting to note that although the English Puritanism stigmatized dance as a sinful occupation, not even Cromwell and the Puritans could prevent the publication of Playford's English Dancing Master in 1651. And another interesting aside, in 1703, in one of the later issues of Playford, the Old Noll's Jig is published. It was written for Cromwell, but not in honor of him, but to mock him. Noll, N-O-L-L, is an archaic word for the top of the head or the crown of the head, and it referred to the round-headedness, roundhead nickname of the parliamentarians. 1658, Cromwell dies. His son succeeds him, but his son is a very weak ruler, and there's a strong force in Parliament that decides they want the throne given back to the next king, who is Charles I's son, Charles II, who's currently in exile in France. Now, this is Charles II. That wig he's wearing is probably inspired by the French court where he spent a lot of time. He was known, he ascended to the throne in 1660, and he was known as the Merry Monarch. There was a lot of dancing, a lot of singing, even on the bordering on hedonism in his court. He was the first monarch to appoint a dancing master to His Majesty. That was Jerome Francis Gohary in 1665. And Gohary was the first of a series of dancing masters employed by the royal family for the next couple of hundred years. This is a painting of Charles showing off his stuff at a ball. This painting was said to have commemorated the ball that was held the evening before he left France for England to regain his throne. And you can see the depiction of the fancy footwork that he was noted for. It's interesting that he promoted religious freedom for Catholics and Protestants and Protestant dissenters. He also went to war with the Dutch over sea trade, and he had to make a secret deal with his cousin, who was Louis XIV, for military assistance. In return for the military assistance, he secretly promised his cousin that he would convert to Catholicism. And this was the war, by the way, that in 1664, the English took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renamed it New York. In 1672, Charles issues a royal declaration promoting religious freedom. Parliament forces him to withdraw it. They want nothing to do with Catholicism. He doesn't dissolve Parliament at this time, though. He goes on for a few more years. 1678, he's making decisions that Parliament doesn't really like. And there's a rumor started by a member of Parliament that there were a contingent of Catholics planning to assassinate Charles. As a result of this, in London, there were attacks on Catholics on the streets. Catholics were being attacked and maimed. But fortunately, the plot fell apart shortly thereafter. The conspirators turned against the leader of the plot. His name is Titus Oates. And Parliament actually at that point decided they had had enough of the religious freedom. They didn't want to take a chance that Catholicism would come back in England. So they voted to exclude Charles from the throne and his brother and any of their heirs. And that's when he dissolved Parliament. Charles dies in 1685, and on his deathbed, he actually does convert to Catholicism. And this is Charles' younger brother, James II. James is openly Catholic. He believes in the divine right of kings. And in 1688, just 3 years after he's coronated, two things very disturbing to the Parliament happened. First is James has a son, also named James. He was James Francis Edward. The other thing is James orders his bishops to read a declaration of indulgence to their flock, which would remove any restrictions on Catholics and any non-conforming Protestants. They're put on trial for seditious libel. Seven of them are put on trial for seditious libel for refusing to read this, but they're acquitted. So James sees himself as losing a lot of power, and the Parliament doesn't like the fact that he has a son, which may create a Catholic dynasty. So going back just to the 1650s for a moment, while James and his brother are in exile in France, there's a gent by the name of Richard Talbot, who became a very trusted associate of them. When Charles II takes the throne, Talbot is sent to Ireland to help the Catholics landowners get their land back that they lost during the English Civil War. When James becomes the king, he appoints Talbot the Viceroy of Ireland. Now, Talbot is the subject of lyrics that are written to the tune Lily Burlero. The tune was originally credited to Henry Purcell, but it appears in a 1661 collection that's titled An Antidote Against Melancholy. And if you've heard the tune, you know that that's true. It's a very lively, happy tune. It was set to bawdy words in 1661. Purcell was 2 years old at the time. So in the late 1680s, Purcell rearranges it for polite society and publishes it under his name. But there's another version that satirizes the appointment of Talbot as the viceroy. Lily Burlero and some of the lyrics, Bullin Allah, were passwords that were used by Irish Catholics in Gaelic to recognize each other during the wars of the 1640s. But this time they were rearranged to mock the Irish, and the lyrics depict a sarcastic conversation between two Irishmen about the imminent arrival of Talbot and what it may mean to the Protestants. So there had been other versions of it, but interestingly, again, there was a version of it that was sung during the US Civil War, and that version mocked Jefferson Davis. Edward Russell is a nobleman, and he gets 6 of his cohorts. They're known as the Immortal Seven, and they invite William of Orange to depose James II in order to preserve Protestantism. This is William and Mary. William is the Duke of Orange. Mary is James's daughter. So Williams is his son-in-law. He's also James's nephew, the son of James's sister. So it's a family affair here. And let's see, in 1688, William lands in England, and it's not seen as an invasion as he was invited by Russell and the Immortal Seven, and the Glorious Revolution or the Williamite Wars start. William has 14,000 men with him, but James has a force of about 30,000. However, the 30,000 are made up of Protestant Englishmen, Irish Catholic regiments who are being mocked. There are riots going on in London right now. The Protestant Englishmen don't want to be seen fighting on the Catholic side. The Catholic regiments of Ireland don't want to be seen fighting for the English. There are mass desertions. Even John Churchill, who goes on to become the Lord Marlborough and figures prominently in another war in the future, he deserts James. He goes to fight on William's side. The war is short, a few skirmishes, relatively bloodless. James is captured, and what William does is he doesn't want to be he doesn't want to be seen to be in the same shoes as Cromwell. So rather than keeping him under heavy guard and worrying about whether he's going to behead him or not, he keeps James under a very light guard somewhere near the Thames River and allows him basically to escape to France. Now, when James escapes, he has the Great Seal. Every king and queen had a seal they would stamp in the hot wax in order to approve of whatever they're approving. So he was escaping and he was seen throwing his seal into the Thames River. Parliament takes this as James's abdication and in that way allows William and Mary to assume the throne without any further battles. Now, they only want to take the throne if they are both co-rulers. So they are crowned co-regents of England. Now, James is not done because he raises some French troops. He lands in Ireland again. He's raising Irish troops. William hears about this in 1690. He goes to Ireland. He defeats him at the Battle of the Boyne, which effectively end the Williamite Wars. And James flees to France again. Now, his followers see him fleeing, and they nickname him in Irish Gaelic, Seamus Ashaka. And for you Gaelic speakers out there, you know what I said already, and I apologize, but Seamus Ashaka translates to James the Turd, not third. His troops are now in full retreat. They retreat west across Ireland to a walled city called Limerick. There was a siege in Limerick during the 1640s, which ended in disaster, but this siege goes on for about 6 months. It also ends in disaster, and it's this siege of Limerick that we know as the Dance Siege of Limerick, which was published in 1698. And that is the end of the Williamite Wars. Now, largely due to his tolerance toward Catholicism, there's continued support for James and later his heirs to return to the throne. And although much of England accepted the rule of William and Mary, there was a minority of the Jacobites who pressed for the restoration of the Stuarts for more than 50 years. There were open Jacobite revolts in 1715 and 1719, 1745 and 6. There were abortive French-backed invasions in 1708 and 1744. There were many more unsuccessful plots. Now, the Stuart descendants, I mentioned James II's son, James. When James II died, his son James claimed the throne, but never claimed the crown, but never wore it. And so he was nicknamed the Old Pretender. He, in turn, has a son named Charles. When that James dies, Charles claims the crown. He's nicknamed the Young Pretender. And you will know James' son Charles as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Bonnie Prince Charlie actively participated in many of the uprisings, but there was a disastrous battle in 1746 at the town of Culloden. And if you're a fan of the show Outlander, you'll know all about this. 1748, the French withdraw all of their support, and the Jacobite secession is basically dead. So who was Jack? As I said at the beginning, there were 20-ish dances over the years with that name in the title. And many of them likely refer to the Jacobites and their support. And here's a list of a few of them. The first two, Jack O'Lent, we know from Lord Carnarvon's Jig. Well, that one and Jack Pudding from Step Stately is 1651, so not them. Jack's Farewell in 1701. Well, farewell Jacobites, maybe. The 1686 Jack's Health. Well, I'm drinking the Jack's Health. I'm in favor of the Jacobites. Jack's Maggot. The ideas, the whims and fancies of the Jacobites, they're going to come back. 1718, well done, Jack. Well, there were those uprisings in the 17 teens there. 1772, Jack, I'll tickle thee. I have no idea. 1816, Jack's Alive. It could be some of the Jacobites talking about the Stuarts, who knows? And then there's a 20th century Jack by the Hedge, which is a dance by Jan Dale all about garlic. There is a current heir, well, a current as of 2012. There's an heir to the Jacobite, to the Stuart throne, Franz, Duke of Bavaria. And in 2012, a spokesman for him has said, the Duke has described his position in line of succession as purely hypothetical and a question which does not concern him. However, there remain a handful of modern supporters who believe in the restoration of the Jacobite succession to the throne.
Tom, thank you very much for a rich history of a period and who is Jack, what are Jacobites? And just like, it's just fun to remember all these people that are associated with English country dance, even in a peripheral way. And plus, as I said before, I'm just loving having something to think about other than vote counting. So this is quite lovely. So thank you, Tom. And I would like everyone to think about, do you have any questions? And if you do, please take a moment and type them into the chat box. And I'm going to talk about what's happening in 2 weeks' time from tonight. 2 weeks from tonight, we have Margaret Berry and Cynthia Shaw. That's Thursday, November 19th at 7:30 p.m. And their topic of discussion is regarding music, the synergy between English country dance and its music. So how do these things come together to make the whole more than the sum of its parts? Before we open it up for questions, I just want to say, Tom, thanks again. Lovely presentation.
My pleasure.
And yeah, and now Q&A. I believe that Danny and possibly Jeff are collecting some questions. Danny.
Well, first, let me again join you in thanking Tom for a wonderful lecture. It was really quite entertaining and informative. Nature pours a vacuum, so there are a few questions, but if there aren't, if they diminish, I'll try to fill that vacuum a bit. But Beverly Francis has a question. So Beverly, why don't you unmute and share your question with Tom?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Well, it has been suggested that Jack may be John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. What do you think of that?
I have seen that often. The Duke of Marlborough had figured very prominently in that in the War of Spanish Succession, and he, as you know, lost favor with the court of Anne for a while, and he and his wife were in exile, and he wasn't able to come back to England. It was self-imposed exile for a while. But yes, I do actually. I hadn't looked into the potential for the Jacks that might refer to him. I was basically sticking with the Jacobites for this particular evening. But yes, I have heard that, and I may look into that for if I ever get a chance to do this again.
Okay, we'll wait for part 2.
Okay, and thank you, Beverly, for Jack's Maggot all those years ago.
My pleasure indeed.
Tom, the dance that's written, I think the date you gave us was 1816. It's hard to imagine a dance being done in 1816 that wouldn't have been a reference in England in particular to their deep concern about the Jacobins and the who were basically identified as kind of left-wing revolutionaries in France. So I'm wondering whether there are different Jacks that are animating the interest in Jack, and even in the ways in which people imagine the dance that they're doing in different moments in time.
Yeah, I actually thought of that briefly. I didn't want to get as deeply into the 19th century history yet, but it, there, the temper of the times, drives a lot of the songs and the dances and things that are written in that period. So there's a very strong possibility that the Jacobins have played a prominent role in that 19th century dance, but I don't know enough about it to comment any further at this point.
Fred Cotton asks whether there was a drinking chalice called a Jack. Do you know that?
Never heard of a Jack as a drinking chalice. Fred, if you have that information, can you email it to me?
I've seen some rough pictures of some.
I hadn't heard of that. Drinking.
So Paul Ross has a question for us. Paul?
Tom, that was wonderful. Thank you. It was so entertaining. I wanted to ask you, what part of your dance experience led you on this search? Was it reading Keller and Scheimer or seeing a movie about Elizabeth? What was it that sparked your curiosity?
Well, originally it was the Keller and Scheimer book, and they have excellent little blurbs with each of the dances as to what they may refer to or some sort of peripheral information. But that really spurred me to look way beyond that into a lot of other things over the years. And like I said at the beginning, I really do enjoy just reading about different historical things. And that's what really started. The motion pictures, well, that was an after effect of it, actually. I enjoy movies once in a while as a diversion, but I don't really see them as something that spurs me on to something like this.
Got it. Thank you.
Tom,
Christine,
you explained this before, but, oh, sorry, Danny.
No,
But
go on.
remind us, it's Jack. So what's this got to do with James? Jacobin, James, what is this?
Jack is short for Jacobus or Jacobus. I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but it's Latin for James. So in Latin, the name James is Jacobus, and it's just short for that.
Thank you.
Christine McKay asks a question. She notes that at least two royals obviously like to dance. What about the others? Of course, we know that George Washington liked to dance, so it wasn't just royals. It would-be royals on this side of the Atlantic as well. Any sense of the others? So I give you another framework perhaps for Christine's question. When these two films appear, of course, is at the same time when there's a whole spate of films like Pride and Prejudice and Emma, and their representations of the dance only draw in part upon these kinds of dances, because we know as well that that English country dance has many different origins. One of them seems to be this kind of Renaissance tradition of these dances. The other, of course, seems to be the dances that come to us from the village green. So the dances that are the circle dances, peace cods, and those kinds of dances. So where did they fit into this story? Or is this really just about the irony of the Jack's Maggot story?
Well, the story that I had tonight, I was kind of limited to about 40 minutes or so. And yeah, it just really, my story just fits into the framework of the Jacobites and the few royals who I found interesting dance stories about. I mean, Elizabeth was relatively famous for doing couple dancing, but we know she didn't do the type of what we call English country dancing. It didn't really exist at the time. or it did in smaller ways. But I just wanted to concentrate on the search for the Jacobites and the religious and political tensions and the military actions that occurred as a result of that the Jacobites resulted from, essentially.
And you did that well.
Oh, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? If not, I think we should, Dorothy, open this up to a bit of more of a social hour for everybody.
Absolutely. I was just going to suggest that. Thank you once again, Tom.
Thank you.
And yeah. And yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and just make this a social time. I think at this point, we will probably stop the Facebook feed so that it's just, you know, we're just in our CDNY room here. So yeah, so unmute yourself as you're speaking, mute yourself as you're not to help prevent feedback.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Pleasure.
If you Google Jack drinking mug, some of them were made out of leather.
Okay.
Uh,
Thank you,
so,
Fred.
Tom, I wanted to ask you another question. The research that you did, is that your own personal library or is that your own personal Google feed or how did you
It's
discover
actually,
this history?
it's actually a mix of many different. I did some Google feeding, yes, but I've been reading about this for 20 years since I first discovered it. And I actually have a library in my home. It's not as big as it used to be. I've been downsizing a bit. And I download books to my Kindle now, makes it more manageable. But it's a lot of different sources, a lot of different books and mixture of that, the Google feed, the Keller and Scheimer. Also, Graham Christian's new book, The Playford Assembly, has a lot of interesting starting information in it, which if you're interested in the dance's history or name, similar to Keller and Scheimer. But yeah, I did a lot of reading on my own on this, and to fill in the blanks and to fill in the spaces, I did some Google feeds, yeah.
Thank you.
But I always tried to confirm it from 2 or 3 different sources. I would never just say it's on the internet, so it's got to be right.
It's good advice for today.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy you've all come. Thank you very much. It's nice to see your faces all out there. It's been a long time and sometimes too long, and really nice to see you all. Got a couple of pages here. This is great. What else? There was there was an interesting. I don't know if you want to take a moment just to listen to this very interesting. There was the Dudley family, and Henry VII had a very close personal advisor named Edmund Dudley. When Henry VIII became king, he found out that Edmund was stealing from the coffers, so he had him killed. Well, he had a son named John Dudley, and John Dudley became the advisor to Edward VI. And when Dudley decided to advise Edward to make Jane Grey the next queen, he was tried for treason and killed. He had a son named Robert Dudley, who is portrayed by Ralph Fiennes as Elizabeth's favorite, and he actually was a favorite of Elizabeth's court. So there's a really nice, interesting parallel there between the Tudor family and the Dudleys. So just thought I'd mention that since there were no more questions. I answered that question in advance. Okay. Stunned silence.
A lot of chuckling going on there in the background, Tom.
You said you didn't have time for a story about Mary and I forget what it was, but
Oh, it was Mary Queen of Scots. Very interesting story. So Mary Queen of Scots is Robert Dudley, who I just mentioned. Elizabeth wants to marry Robert Dudley, who she probably was secretly in love with, to Mary Queen of Scots, and they were going to be invited to stay at the court, so she would still have Robert Dudley there to dance with. And Mary, unbeknownst to her at the time, was trying to usurp the throne. Robert Dudley decided not to marry Mary Queen of Scots. Now, Mary Queen of Scots was she was a descendant who was one of the royal family there. And her, she was, I think, the grandmother of James VI. But anyway, possibly the mother of James VI. But anyway, she marries someone else, and I don't have his name here. It also started with a D. But shortly after she marries him, he's found dead under mysterious circumstances. The idea is that she had him killed, and I'm not sure why. Like
Lord Darnley.
Lord Darnley, thank you, Beverly. So Mary flees to England because she's afraid she's going to be prosecuted. And she's kept under house arrest by Elizabeth under the guise of protection. But she's actually eventually executed by Elizabeth. Now, Scotland was seen as a Catholic ally of Spain. And Mary I's husband, Philip, who was the king, who was back in Spain at this time, didn't like the fact that Elizabeth killed Mary Queen of Scots. So Philip decides to invade England, and that's the whole story of the Spanish Armada. Now, Roanoke was settled, I think it was 1686, and Walter Raleigh came back to England for more supplies, and they were supposed to bring them back, but they were stuck in England now because the Armada came, and then the weather was wrong to go back, and they couldn't get back to Roanoke for a couple of years. So when they got back, of course, they found that Roanoke had disappeared. So the contention is that if Elizabeth hadn't executed Mary Queen of Scots, the Armada wouldn't have happened at that point anyway, and Roanoke may have been successful. So that's a nutshell version.
So Tom, is your own family as complicated as these families you're now studying in English history?
Well, compared to these families in English history, my family's in a coma. Different complications. Yeah, there's too much to, it's great. I just love following all of this stuff. But
Tom, did you read the research about the Roanoke community possibly having gone to live with an Indian tribe on a nearby island?
yes, I did. There was a lot of things that came out in the last couple of years about Roanoke. I heard a story years ago, and I'm not sure. I didn't look into it thoroughly, so I'm only going to mention some hearsay now. That when the resupply ships never came back, the colonists were having trouble with the indigenous folks, and some of them were able to retreat or escape to the mountains of Appalachia. And I wish I could find it again, but years ago I read a study that said there are some words that are used only in some isolated areas of Appalachia that are very similar to the late Middle English that was spoken in the 16th century and could have been descendant from the Roanokes, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. one of my readings that I lost years ago.
There were artifacts discovered on the island in the Outer Banks, not too far from where Roanoke would have been, a particular Indian tribe, a mixture of artifacts of native and English.
Yeah, I'd read there was a study of that. It was released about 3 years ago, I think. There was
Maybe.
yeah, I remember reading about that. It was pretty big news in the archaeological world.
But it's hard to tell either way whether those folks danced. I mean, come on, let's keep it to what we care about. Oh, sorry.
Probably not. Didn't have time to that.
I wish we could go back and put a camera on a lot of these places and see what they were doing in practice
Yeah,
in terms of dancing.
yeah. That would be interesting. That was a great painting, though. That I only found that recently on the internet. The painting of Charles II dancing in France before he left for England.